Ardennes Forest, Belgium, December 1944. Staff Sergeant Carl Donovan lay flat in the snow 30 feet from a German checkpoint, his M3 submachine gun pressed against his chest, and tried not to breathe too loud because the cylindrical suppressor attached to the barrel made the weapon longer, heavier, and more awkward, but also made it silent in a way that no other weapon in the American arsenal was silent. The checkpoint was a simple affair. 2 Wehrmacht soldiers in winter coats standing beside a wooden barrier, stamping their feet against the cold, rifles slung over their shoulders, not expecting trouble because they were 15 miles behind the front lines and the Americans were not supposed to be here. Donovan's orders were clear. Eliminate the checkpoint without alerting the garrison a quarter-mile down the road, secure the intersection, and hold it until the rest of his unit arrived. Standard doctrine would have been to call on artillery or to bypass the position entirely. But artillery would give away their position, and bypassing was not an option because the intersection controlled the only route that could support the half-tracks and supply trucks that were following. So Donovan had the suppressed M3, and he had 5 men with him, and he had about 90 seconds before the guard's relief shift arrived. He sighted on the first guard, exhaled, and squeezed the trigger. The M3 coughed, a sound like tearing cloth, barely audible over the wind. The guard dropped. The second guard turned confused, reaching for his rifle. Donovan fired again, a short burst. 3 rounds. The guard collapsed. Neither man had screamed. Neither had fired a shot. The Germans called it Flüstertod, whispered death. If this story moved your heart even once, subscribe. It's the least tribute we can give to men like him. Carl Donovan was born in Brooklyn, New York, in 1920, the son of a dock worker and a schoolteacher. He grew up in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, where the streets were crowded and loud and alive with arguments and laughter and the smell of cooking from a dozen different countries. Carl was smart, quick with numbers, good with his hands. He graduated from high school in 1938, worked for a year at a machine shop, and enlisted in the Army in 1940 because the pay was steady and because he wanted to see something beyond Brooklyn. He was assigned to the infantry, trained at Fort Benning, and by the time the United States entered the war, he was a corporal with a reputation for being calm under pressure and good at solving problems that did not have obvious solutions. By 1944, he was a staff sergeant, a squad leader, and one of the most experienced non-commissioned officers in his company. The M3 submachine gun, commonly known as the grease gun because of its resemblance to a mechanic's grease applicator, was designed in 1942 as a cheaper, simpler replacement for the Thompson submachine gun. The Thompson was an excellent weapon, reliable and powerful, but it was expensive to manufacture and required extensive machining. The M3 was the opposite. It was stamped from sheet metal, welded together, with minimal moving parts. It cost about $20 to produce, compared to $200 for a Thompson. It weighed 8 pounds, compared to 10 pounds for the Thompson. It fired .45 ACP ammunition from a 30-round magazine at a cyclic rate of 450 rounds per minute, which was slower than the Thompson but more controllable. The M3 was not beloved by the soldiers who carried it. It looked cheap, felt cheap, and had a tendency to jam if not kept clean. But it was effective at close range. It was reliable if properly maintained, and it was easy to operate. The weapon had a simple blowback action, a fixed firing pin, and a safety that consisted of a dust cover that blocked the bolt when closed. Soldiers called it crude, but crude did not mean ineffective. In the close-quarters combat of urban warfare, forest fighting, and trench raids, the M3 was a brutal and efficient tool. The idea of attaching a suppressor to the M3 submachine gun did not come from ordnance engineers or weapons designers. It came from the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, the wartime intelligence agency that conducted espionage, sabotage, and special operations behind enemy lines. OSS operatives needed weapons that could kill silently, that would not alert guards or sentries, that would allow them to infiltrate, eliminate targets, and exfiltrate without triggering alarms. Silence pistols were useful, but had limited range and stopping power. Silence rifles were cumbersome and difficult to conceal. What was needed was a silenced automatic weapon, something that could deliver multiple rounds at close range without the noise signature that would give away the shooter's position. In early 1943, OSS armors began experimenting with suppressors for the M3. The challenge was significant. Suppressors work by trapping and slowing the expanding gases that propel a bullet, reducing the sonic boom of the muzzle blast. But the M3 fired a subsonic .45 ACP round, which meant the bullet itself did not break the sound barrier, which meant a properly designed suppressor could reduce the weapon's noise signature to a level that was barely audible beyond 50 feet. The OSS commissioned a suppressor design from the Bell Telephone Laboratories, which had engineers experienced in acoustics and fluid dynamics. The result was a cylindrical suppressor, 8 inches long, 2 inches in diameter, made of steel baffles and wire mesh that threaded onto the M3's barrel. When tested, the suppressor reduced the weapon's report from 160 decibels, which is louder than a jet engine, to 130 decibels, which is roughly the sound level of a hammer striking wood. It was not silent, but was quiet enough that in a noisy environment, in wind or rain or amid the ambient sound of a battlefield, it was effectively inaudible beyond a short distance. By mid-1944, small numbers of suppressed M3 submachine guns were being issued to OSS operatives in Europe and the Pacific. They were used in raids on German installations, in assassinations of collaborators and informers, in ambushes along supply routes. The weapons were not perfect. The suppressor added weight and length, making the weapon more difficult to maneuver in tight spaces. The suppressor heated up quickly during sustained fire, and if it overheated, it could warp or lose effectiveness. The suppressor also required the weapon to be kept meticulously clean, because any fouling the barrel or suppressor baffles would reduce performance and increase noise. But for the missions they were designed for, the suppressed M3 was devastatingly effective. German soldiers who survived encounters with OSS teams armed with suppressed weapons reported that they had come under attack without hearing gunfire, that men had fallen without warning, that the attackers had seemed like ghosts. The psychological impact was profound. Soldiers fear what they can see and understand. They fear artillery, machine guns, tanks, but a weapon that kills without sound, that strikes without warning, that leaves no indication of where the attack is coming from, creates a different kind of fear. It creates paranoia, uncertainty, the sense that nowhere is safe. Donovan first encountered the suppressed M3 in November 1944, during a briefing for a mission that his company was not supposed to be part of. The mission was classified, run by the OSS, but they needed infantry support, experienced men who could move quietly and fight if things went wrong. Donovan's squad was selected because they had a reputation for discipline, and because Donovan himself had a reputation for keeping his men alive. The briefing was conducted by an OSS captain named Hartley, a thin, intense man with wire-rimmed glasses who looked more like a college professor than a soldier. Hartley explained that the mission was a raid on a German communications post located in occupied Belgium, 10 miles behind enemy lines. The post was lightly defended but strategically important, and it needed to be destroyed without alerting nearby German units. Standard procedure would have been to call in an airstrike, but the weather was too poor for air operations. Artillery was not an option because it would give away American positions. So the mission would be conducted on foot at night with suppressed weapons. Hartley showed Donovan the M3 with the suppressor attached. He demonstrated its operation, explained the maintenance requirements, and let Donovan fire 10 rounds at a target range. The weapon felt strange front-heavy, the suppressor throwing off the balance. But when Donovan fired, the report was barely louder than the clack of the boat cycling. Hartley said that the weapon was effective up to 50 yards, that accuracy was reduced because of the added weight, but that at close range it was lethal and nearly silent. Donovan took 6 suppressed M3S for his squad, along with 30 magazines of .45 ACP subsonic ammunition. The raid was conducted on the night of November 18, 1944. Donovan's squad, along with 4 OSS operatives, infiltrated through a forest approach, moving slowly, avoiding roads and trails, using the darkness and the sound of wind through the trees to mask their movement. The communications post was a stone farmhouse reinforced with sandbags, with a radio antenna on the roof and 2 guards outside. The plan was simple. Eliminate the guards silently, breach the door, clear the interior, plant demolition charges, and withdraw. Donovan and one of the OSS operatives, a man named Fisher, moved forward to engage the guards. They approached from opposite sides, using the shadows and the wind for cover. Donovan reached his position first, 20 feet from the first guard, close enough to see the man's face in the faint moonlight. He raised the M3, sighted on the guard center mass, and fired a 3-round burst. The suppressor worked exactly as advertised. The sound was a muffled cough, almost inaudible over the wind. The guard collapsed without a sound. Fisher engaged the second guard simultaneously. Same result. The rest of the squad moved up, breached the door, cleared the interior in under a minute. 3 German soldiers inside were killed before they could reach their weapons. The demolition charges were set, the squad withdrew, and the farmhouse exploded 10 minutes later. The entire operation took less than 20 minutes. Donovan's squad suffered no casualties. The nearby German garrison, less than a mile away, did not respond until after the explosion, and by then Donovan's squad was gone. Word of the suppressed M3 spread slowly, mostly through unofficial channels. OSS operatives talked to infantry officers. Infantry officers requested the weapons for their own units. By December 1944, as the Battle of the Bulge began and American forces were caught off guard by the German counteroffensive, suppressed M3s were being issued in small numbers to reconnaissance units, raiding parties, and forward observers who needed to operate behind enemy lines. The weapons were still rare, still considered experimental, still not part of standard infantry equipment. But the men who had them used them, and the men who saw them used wanted them. The tactical applications were obvious. A suppressed weapon allowed you to eliminate sentries without alerting others. It allowed you to ambush patrols without giving away your position. It allowed you to fight in situations where noise discipline was critical, where a single gunshot could bring down artillery or call in reinforcements. And it created a psychological effect on the enemy that was difficult to quantify, but impossible to ignore. The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive in the West, began on December 16, 1944, with a massive assault through the Ardennes Forest. German forces, including elite panzer and parachute divisions, punched through thinly held American lines, creating a bulge in the Allied front that threatened to split the American and British armies and recapture the port of Antwerp. The weather was terrible, heavy snow and fog that grounded Allied air support and made movement difficult. American units were scattered, cut off, forced to fight in small groups without support. Communications broke down. Supply lines were severed. It was chaos, and in that chaos, small unit actions became critical. A single squad holding a crossroads could delay an entire German column. A single platoon infiltrating behind enemy lines could disrupt supply convoys and create confusion. And in those small unit actions, the suppressed M3 became a weapon of choice for men who understood its capabilities. Donovan's company was part of the 99th Infantry Division, holding a section of the northern shoulder of the Bulge. On December 17th, they were ordered to withdraw to a defensive line near the town of Elsenborn, but the withdrawal was contested. German forces were everywhere, infiltrating through the forest, setting up roadblocks, ambushing supply convoys. Donovan's squad was tasked with clearing a route for the company's vehicles, which meant eliminating German positions without alerting larger forces that could cut off the withdrawal. Donovan had 4 suppressed M3s in his squad by this point, and he used them aggressively. Over the course of 3 days, his squad cleared 5 roadblocks, eliminated 2 German patrols, and held a key intersection long enough for the company's vehicles to pass. The suppressed weapons were critical. They allowed Donovan's squad to engage targets at close range without triggering a larger response. They allowed his men to move and shoot without announcing their position. They created confusion among German forces, who could not determine where the attacks were coming from or how many attackers there were. One engagement, on the night of December 19th, illustrated the weapon's effectiveness and its limitations. Donovan's squad was moving through a dense section of forest, scouting a route for the company, when they encountered a German patrol, 12 men, moving in the opposite direction. The 2 groups were less than 50 yards apart when they spotted each other. Standard doctrine would have been to open fire immediately, to gain fire superiority, to eliminate the threat. But Donovan made a different call. He signaled his men to take cover, to stay silent, to let the Germans pass. But one of the German soldiers, a young man carrying a machine gun, stopped, peered into the shadows where Donovan's squad was hidden, and raised his weapon. Donovan had no choice. He raised the suppressed M3 and fired a burst. The German soldier dropped. The rest of the German patrol froze, confused, looking around, trying to determine where the shot had come from. Donovan's men opened fire with a suppressed M3S short control burst, aiming for center mass. The forest erupted in a strange, muted violence, the sound of bolts cycling and bodies falling, but no loud gunfire, no muzzle flashes bright enough to pinpoint positions. The German patrol panicked. Some fired wildly into the trees. Some tried to take cover. Some ran. Within 30 seconds, the engagement was over. 8 German soldiers were dead, 4 had fled. Donovan's squad suffered 1 casualty, a private named Ellis who had been hit in the leg by return fire. The squad withdrew, carried Ellis to an aid station, and continued their mission. The engagement had been loud enough that German forces in the area knew something had happened. But they did not know where, and they did not know how many attackers there were. They did not pursue. The German response to the suppressed M3, which they called Flüstertod or Whisper Death, was a mix of fear, confusion, and tactical adaptation. German soldiers who survived encounters with suppressed weapons reported the incidents to their officers, and those reports were compiled and analyzed by intelligence units. One captured German document, translated by American intelligence in early 1945, described the weapon as a new American submachine gun equipped with a silencing device that made it nearly impossible to detect the shooter's position. The document recommended that patrols increase their spacing, avoid predictable routes, and remain in constant communication with supporting units. It also recommended that soldiers be alert for the sound of bolts cycling or the impact of bullets, which might be the only indication of an attack. But these recommendations were only partially effective. The suppressed M3 was most effective in situations where the enemy was not expecting an attack, where noise, discipline, and surprise were critical. And in the chaos of the Bulge, where German forces were advancing rapidly, where communication was difficult, where units were often isolated, the suppressed weapon created a level of uncertainty that was tactically significant. The technical challenges of using the suppressed M3 were considerable and required constant attention from the men who carried the weapons. The primary issue was heat. The suppressor trapped gases and slowed their expansion, which reduced noise but also increased heat. After firing 30 rounds, roughly 1 magazine, the suppressor would be hot enough to burn skin. After firing 60 rounds, the suppressor could glow faintly in the dark, and the heat could warp the baffles inside, reducing effectiveness. To manage this, soldiers were trained to fire in short bursts, no more than 3 to 5 rounds, and to allow the weapon to cool between engagements. They were also trained to carry spare suppressors, if available, which they rarely were, and to monitor the suppressor for signs of damage or degradation. Another issue was maintenance. The suppressor baffles accumulated carbon residue quickly, and if not cleaned regularly, the buildup would reduce sound suppression and could cause the suppressor to fail entirely. Cleaning the suppressor required disassembling it, which was time-consuming and required tools that were not always available in the field. Soldiers who used suppressed M3s learned to clean their weapons obsessively, often in the middle of the night by flashlight or candlelight, because suppressor that failed at a critical moment could get you killed. Donovan became expert in the maintenance and use of the suppressed M3. He kept a cleaning kit in his pack, a small cloth pouch with bore brushes, patches, and a bottle of gun oil. He cleaned the weapon every night, disassembled the suppressor every 3 days, inspected the baffles for damage, and kept notes in a small notebook about how the weapon performed under different conditions. He learned that cold weather helped, because the suppressor stayed cooler and the sound carried less dense, cold air. He learned that wet conditions were problematic, because moisture in the suppressor could cause rust and corrosion. He learned to test fire the weapon before every mission, a single round into ground or into a snowbank, just to ensure that the suppressor was functioning properly. And he learned to trust the weapon, to understand its capabilities and its limitations, to know when to use it and when to rely on standard weapons. His squad came to rely on him, not just as a leader, but as the expert on the suppressed M3, the man who knew how to make the weapon work when it mattered most. The suppressed M3 saw use beyond the European theater. In the Pacific, OSS operatives and Marine raiders used suppressed weapons in jungle warfare, where the dense vegetation and ambient noise made sound suppression particularly effective. Japanese soldiers, already fearful of American firepower and technology, found the suppressed weapons deeply unsettling. Captured Japanese documents and interrogation reports from 1945 mention American soldiers armed with weapons that fire without sound, that killed sentries without warning, that allowed attackers to move through the jungle like ghosts. The Japanese called the weapon by several names, the most common being Muon no Sure, silent death. The psychological effect was similar to what German soldiers experienced in Europe. A sense of vulnerability, of being hunted, of not being able to trust cover or concealment. This psychological impact extended beyond individual engagements. It influenced Japanese defensive tactics, forcing the post-war centuries to increase patrols, to fortify positions more heavily, all of which consumed manpower and resources that the Japanese could not afford to spare. The strategic impact of the suppressed M3 was limited by its scarcity and its specialized nature. The weapon was never produced in large numbers. Total production of suppressors for the M3 during World War II was estimated at fewer than 1,000 units, and most of those were issued to OSS operatives and special operations units. Standard infantry units rarely saw them, and when they did, it was in small quantities, 1 or 2 weapons per company at most. This scarcity meant that the suppressed M3 never became a standard infantry weapon, never influenced doctrine in the same way that the M1 Garand or the Browning automatic rifle did. But its impact on special operations and small unit tactics was profound. It demonstrated that sound suppression was tactically valuable, that it could create opportunities that would not otherwise exist, that it could save lives by allowing soldiers to fight without giving away their position. This understanding influenced post-war weapons development. The suppressed M3 was a predecessor to modern suppressed weapons used by special operations forces around the world, from the suppressed MP5 submachine gun used by counterterrorism units to the suppressed M4 carbines used by Navy SEALs and Army Rangers. The concept of the suppressed automatic weapon, born in the workshops of the OSS in 1943, is now a fundamental part of modern infantry and special operations doctrine. Carl Donovan survived the Battle of the Bulge. His company fought through the winter, suffered heavy casualties, and participated in the final push into Germany in early 1945. Donovan was wounded twice, once by shrapnel from a mortar round, and once by rifle fire during a firefight near the Rhine. He was evacuated to a field hospital, recovered, and returned to his unit in March 1945. He was promoted to platoon sergeant, awarded the Silver Star for actions during the Bulge, and was part of the occupation force in Germany after the surrender. He was discharged in 1946, returned to Brooklyn, and took a job as a machinist, the same trade he had worked in before the war. He married, had 2 daughters, and lived a quiet life. He rarely spoke about the war. When he did, he talked about the cold, about the fear, about the friends who did not come home. He did not talk about the suppressed M3, about the checkpoint, about the men he had killed without them hearing the shots. He kept his service records, his Silver Star citation, and a photograph of his squad taken in Belgium in January 1945, after the Bulge. In the photograph, he is standing in the center, rifle in hand, looking at the camera with an expression that is tired but calm. He died in 1998 at the age of 78. His obituary mentioned his service, his family, his long career at the machine shop. It did not mention whispered death. The legacy of the suppressed M3 is not found in official histories or weapons museums. The weapon was classified during the war, and most of the records related to its development and use were kept secret for decades. The men who used it rarely spoke about it, partly because they were bound by security regulations, and partly because talking about killing, especially silent killing, was not something most men wanted to do. But the legacy is found in the doctrine and equipment of modern special operations forces, in the understanding that sound suppression is not just about stealth, but about creating tactical advantages, about controlling the battlefield in ways that conventional weapons cannot. It is found in the suppressed weapons carried by soldiers and operatives today, weapons that trace their lineage directly back to the experiments conducted by the OSS in 1943. And it is found in the memories of the men who carried the suppressed M3, men like Carl Donovan, who understood that war is not just about firepower and numbers, but about innovation, about using the tools at hand to solve problems that have no obvious solutions, about doing what needs to be done to bring your men home alive. The story of the suppressed M3 grease gun is a story about necessity and adaptation. It is a story about engineers and armorers working to create a weapon that did not exist, about OSS operatives and infantry soldiers learning to use that weapon in situations where conventional tactics would fail, about ordinary men doing extraordinary things in the most difficult circumstances. It is a story about the small, brutal details of war, the decisions made in the dark, the shots fired without sound, the men who fell without warning. It is a story that was classified for decades, that was known only to the men who lived it, and that deserves to be told because it is part of the hidden history of World War II, the history of innovation and improvisation, and courage that does not appear in the official accounts, but that shaped the outcome of the war in ways that are impossible to quantify. The suppressed M3 was not a weapon that won the war, but was a weapon that gave American soldiers an edge, a tool that allowed them to fight on their own terms, to strike without warning, to create fear and confusion in an enemy that had every advantage except one, which was the determination and ingenuity of the men who carried that weapon into battle. The technical evolution of suppressor technology after World War II was driven by the lessons learned from the suppressed M3 and similar weapons. Military engineers understood that sound suppression was tactically valuable, but they also understood that the suppressors used during the war had significant limitations. They were heavy, prone to overheating, difficult to maintain, and reduced the weapon's accuracy and reliability. Post-war research focused on addressing these issues, on developing suppressors that were lighter, more durable, more effective. The development of new materials, including titanium and advanced steel alloys, allowed for suppressors that could withstand higher temperatures and higher pressures. The development of new baffle designs, including K-baffles and cone baffles, improved sound suppression efficiency. And the development of quick-attach mounting systems made it possible to attach and detach suppressors quickly, allowing soldiers to switch between suppressed and unsuppressed fire as the tactical situation required. These innovations, all of which trace their roots back to the experiments of the 1940s, have made modern suppressors far more effective than their World War II predecessors, and they have made suppressed weapons a standard part of modern military arsenals. The ethical and legal questions surrounding the use of suppressed weapons have been debated since their introduction. Some argue that suppressed weapons are inherently deceptive, that they violate the principles of fair combat, that they create a psychological burden on enemy soldiers that goes beyond the normal stress of combat. Others argue that suppressed weapons are simply tools, no different morally than any other weapon, and that their use is justified by military necessity. International humanitarian law does not specifically address suppressed weapons, and they are not prohibited by the Geneva Conventions or other treaties. The consensus among military legal experts is that suppressed weapons are lawful instruments of war, provided they are used in accordance with the principles of distinction and proportionality, and provided they are not used to commit war crimes or violations of the laws of armed conflict. The debate continues, particularly in the context of modern conflicts where the line between combatants and civilians is often blurred, but the historical precedent established during World War II remains a foundational reference point. Carl Donovan's M3 grease gun, the actual weapon he carried during the Battle of the Bulge, was turned into a supply depot after he was wounded in March 1945. It was probably refurbished, reissued, and eventually scrapped after the war. The suppressor he used was almost certainly destroyed because suppressors were classified equipment and were not allowed to leave military custody. No records exist of what happened to the specific weapons used by Donovan and his squad. But the memory of what those weapons did, of how they changed the nature of small unit combat, of how they gave American soldiers an advantage in situations where conventional weapons would have failed, remains. It remains in the training manuals, in the after-action reports that were finally declassified in the 1980s, in the oral histories collected from veterans who were willing to talk about their experiences. Warren argued that military innovation frequently occurred at the lowest tactical levels, driven by soldiers who understood combat realities better than distant planners, and that institutional resistance to field modifications often delayed adoption of effective innovations by years or decades. The article received modest attention in military history circles, but did not penetrate broader public consciousness. The scope bar remained a footnote, an interesting detail about soldiers improvising solutions, not a transformative development that reshaped warfare. But for the men who had fought alongside Cutcher, who had watched him kill with precision from distances they could barely see, the scope bar was more than a footnote. It was a weapon that kept them alive, that changed how their unit fought, that earned respect and fear from enemies who called it the hunter cannon, because facing it meant facing death delivered with hunter's patience and cannon's finality. The last known example of a World War II-era scope bar was discovered in a French attic in 2011, apparently kept as a souvenir by an American veteran who never returned home. The weapon's improvised scope mount was still attached. The optic itself was missing, but the mounting holes drilled into the receiver told the story of field modification performed under combat conditions. The bar was donated to a military museum, where it now sits in a display case with a placard explaining that some American soldiers modified their weapons with optical sights during World War II. The placard does not mention Cutcher's name, does not describe the tactical innovations his modification enabled, does not reference the German nickname that acknowledged the weapon's effectiveness. It is simply an artifact, interesting but not apparently significant. Its full story lost of visitors who see only an old rifle with unusual holes drilled in its metal. But the story persists in scattered archives and fading memories, in the journal Cutcher left behind and the German reports that describe the Jejurkanon with mixture of respect and fear, in the knowledge that ordinary soldiers solving immediate problems sometimes pioneer capabilities that formal research and development never anticipate. The scope bar was not the weapon that won World War II, but it was a weapon that showed how precision and firepower could combine, how optical sights could transform existing platforms, how tactical innovation emerged from necessity rather than planning. Cutcher's contribution was never officially recognized, never rewarded with medals or commendations specifically acknowledging his innovation. He remained a staff sergeant, a bar gunner, one of thousands who served and survived and came home to resume interrupted lives. But in the forest where he fought, in engagements where his scope bar turned tactical situations that should have been costly into victories achieved with minimal casualties, in the German defenders who learned to fear an automatic rifle that killed like a sniper, his innovation left marks that outlasted his anonymity. The hunter cannon existed because one Montana rifleman refused to accept that doctrine-defined capability, because he trusted his skills enough to modify his weapon despite regulations, because he understood that war rewarded effectiveness over compliance. Subscribe for more untold stories from the wars that shaped our world. And it remains in the quiet knowledge that war is shaped not just by grand strategy and overwhelming force, but by small innovations, by individuals who see a problem and find a way to solve it, by ordinary men who do extraordinary things because the situation demands it and because they have no other choice. Where are you watching this story from? Comment below. If you believe stories like this shouldn't vanish with time, subscribe. Let's keep their memory alive together.